the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali Karp. It's Tuesday, December 2nd, 2014. Egypt's revolution comes full circle as old charges against former dictator Hosni Mubarak are dropped. We'll examine why the country that was at the heart of the Arab Spring is struggling to attain justice. And we'll go live to Lima, Peru, where a crucial UN climate conference has just started. Plus, attorney Jessica Karp dissects President Obama's executive action on immigration. Who is eligible and for how long? Who was left out and why? That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's breaking headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, the World Food Programme is suspending food vouchers to nearly 2 million Syrian refugees because it has literally run out of money. Refugees fleeing the devastating civil war have made their way to the neighboring countries of Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, and were surviving primarily on the WFP's donations of vouchers that they could spend in their host countries for food. The UN program has issued an urgent international appeal for the $64 million it will need to feed the refugees through this month. Meanwhile, Lebanon's government has announced it has captured the wife and son of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The two were apparently attempting to cross into Lebanon from Syria. The U.S. has headed a 4-month-long military operation against ISIS that seems to have made little progress so far. Well, Cristina, I wonder what fraction of a single U.S. fighter jet it would take to feed 1.7 million Syrian refugees.
Well, we could definitely, probably assume that if U.S. fighter jets were used for other purposes, such as feeding refugees, instead of bringing mass violence to people living in the Middle Eastern region, 1.7 million refugees could be fed. But it's clear that the U.S. has no interest in finding solutions for people who had to leave a war that they very much lead. And so, but again, this shouldn't be a surprise if the U.S.-led wars in the Middle East have forced some of us, in many ways to confront the ongoing empire practices of this country. But it also seems to me that a story like this regarding the World Food Program raises one important question that needs to be addressed. And that question is whether we should leave it up to an international organization to ensure the survival of millions of people, or whether we should actually force governmental institutions to begin to look to other solutions that replace military occupations with more humane and peaceful strategies that really aren't only just to feed millions of refugees, but actually get them back to their homes.
And then the U.S. Supreme Court is facing a dilemma unique to our age of social media and online communications, and that is how to tackle threats made digitally. In the case of Alanis versus the U.S., a Pennsylvania man made elaborate and violent death threats against his wife on Facebook, and the Supreme Court justices must now decide whether those constitute exceptions to the First Amendment. In addition to its impact on domestic violence, the case is relevant to the recent controversy that became known as Gamergate, when female video game reviewers were threatened after criticizing misogyny in games. Online forums are popular avenues for male rage against women in general, whether in comment sections or on online social media sites. Well, Cristina, how significant is this case to you?
Well, anytime that we have a case that raises questions about violence on social media, it's important to put it into context. Let's understand that these questions aren't necessarily new, although the age of social media does raise more challenges. But just as violence, for instance, on television, film, music, video games, helps promote a culture in which people have become desensitized to violence, social media have also underscored how violence passed off as art, which makes this case even more interesting, can be defended and supported in this country. And so this, of course, has consequences, right? These consequences are manifested in this pervasive rape culture where violence against women is legitimized, dismissed, and even seen as a joke. So the significance of this case is that it provides more evidence for really illustrating just how violence is increasingly becoming part of our everyday lives. Even in the absence of physical war in our immediate environments, that realization should concern us all.
And finally, a day after President Obama met with a series of activist, faith and law enforcement leaders regarding the ongoing tensions in Ferguson, Missouri, his administration has announced some policy changes. Among those are $75 million in funding for body-worn cameras for police officers. and a task force to examine policing practices in the U.S. Some activists were disappointed he did not go far enough. Meanwhile, Attorney General Eric Holder also announced yesterday that the Justice Department will release new guidelines aimed at ending police racial profiling. A student campaign dubbed Hands Up Walk Out in dozens of cities across the U.S. yesterday resulted in a mass walkout at 12:01 p.m. Central, the time that Michael Brown was fatally shot by Darren Wilson. And 5 members of the St. Louis Rams NFL team who raised their hands in solidarity with Ferguson protesters have come under fire from police unions. The players have remained steadfast in their political protests, saying they refuse to apologize. Well, Cristina, how serious a turning point has Ferguson become on our national conversation on race and police brutality?
Well, just as violence permeates our online interactions, it does so physically, particularly in brown and black communities. The fact that the protests in Ferguson have lasted for at least 4 months is a testament to the endurance and spirit of the young activists we see today, every day on the streets of Ferguson and in every other major city in this country. So there is a serious turning point in this national conversation. But let's be clear about a couple of things. Obama's speech made last Monday did nothing to address the bigger problems that Ferguson points to. It's not only race, but also state power, militarization, and corporate interests that should be at the center of this conversation. So while Obama's meeting with activists is welcomed and a step forward, his proposals, for instance, the camera solution, do very little to address the bigger issues that would directly implicate his own national and international policies, which are also, by the way, racial. There are racial discourses and racialized implications here. But if we want to move this conversation even further, we really will have to force the president himself to come to terms with his own repressive military policies.
Well, Cristina, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. On November 20th, when President Obama announced that he was using his discretionary power as president to take executive action on immigration, pro-immigrant communities celebrated, hoping it meant undocumented immigrants and their families were protected, while conservative anti-immigrant groups accused the president of illegal overreach and offering amnesty. What the president actually offered was perhaps something in between. He outlined policies that would enable only a portion of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. to apply for temporary relief from deportation. Only about 4 million people may actually be eligible to apply, and of those, no one is actually guaranteed anything. The action comes 2 years after Obama offered temporary relief to a segment of the so-called Dreamers, young immigrants who came to the U.S. as minors and knew only this nation as their home. That policy was called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, and only about half of those eligible even applied. The new policy is called Deferred Action for Parental Accountability, or DAPA. So who is eligible for relief from deportation and for how long? What sort of process will they have to go through? Who is not eligible and why? Joining us to answer those questions is my guest, Jessica Karp. She's a staff attorney with the National Day Labor Organizing Network. Welcome to Uprising, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, let us talk about who is eligible. It's called DAPA, as I understand. And one of the things that I understand that the president's policy does is that it does expand who is eligible for the earlier policy. And it allows the parents of U.S. citizens and permanent residents, not the folks eligible under DACA, but U.S. citizens and permanent residents' parents are now possibly eligible to apply. Is that accurate?
That's right. So with respect to the DACA program, which is the program that President Obama established in 2002, it removes the age cap. And so DACA is a program that allows people who came here as children, grew up here, went to high school here, to legalize their status temporarily. Previously, you had to be under 31. So for example, if you came at the age of 5, had lived here for 30 years, you were actually ineligible for the previous DACA program because you had aged out. The new expanded program removes that age cap, and it changes the date from which you had to have been living in the U.S. It used to be 2012, and now it pushes it to 2010.
So does it remove the age cap entirely?
Yes, it removes the age cap.
So what does that mean about how many more people could possibly be eligible under that original program? And the 4 million that are eligible under what President Obama announced, does it include those?
They're separate. So
Okay.
this expansion of DACA is much smaller than the 4 million. It's a few 100,000 people. And some of these are, as I said, the most compelling cases, because the idea behind DACA is that people who've grown up in the United States, who've known no other country, and who've, gotten an education here should be able to contribute to the country, should be able to work lawfully. And that includes, obviously, people who are over 30 but have lived here since their childhood.
Right. So then let's talk about the parents of people who are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, so so-called green card holders as we think of them. These are not parents whose children may be undocumented and come here as minors. These are simply parents of people who are already citizens and who might have come on a visa and overstayed, etc., right?
That's correct. They're parents of U.S. citizens and lawful residents. And that means that at some point in the future, under current existing immigration laws, a visa will be available to them, but in many cases it's not for decades. A child can't sponsor his or her parents for a visa until she's 21 years old. And so, for example, the parent of a 5-year-old U.S. citizen would be waiting 16 years to get that visa. So what this program does is temporarily legalize the status of those parents who eventually will have a visa available for them.
So if an undocumented couple had a child in the United States, obviously by birth the child is a U.S. citizen, now those parents would be eligible for essentially temporary relief from deportation. They're not getting amnesty, they're not getting citizenship certainly, or even a visa.
Right. What the program provides is temporary relief for deportation, so a little protection from the fear that when you leave the house in the morning, you can know you'll be coming home at night. And it provides work authorization too, which is very important for many people. So it allows people to work lawfully.
But it's not a blanket thing. You have to actually apply for it, right? And so let's talk about this aspect of it, which was also the case under the earlier program 2 years ago, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. People who might be eligible have to basically turn themselves in, out themselves as undocumented immigrants, and get this temporary relief in the hopes that that information won't be used against them potentially in the future.
That's correct. It's an application process. People have to apply to United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. There's an application fee, and there's no guarantee that the application will be approved, although there are general criteria, and if you fit the general criteria, you can expect that they'll apply those to your case, and you can predict the outcome.
So say somebody got the status under DACA, but were caught up in a raid. I mean, is Border Patrol, are officials who, in some states, even police, who might turn you over to immigration officials, checking to see, oh, this person has gotten temporary relief, so we won't deport them?
Well, sort of the flip side of this DAPA program that the president announced are new enforcement priorities for deportation that coincide with the DAPA program. And under those new priorities, theoretically, ICE immigration enforcement should not be focusing on people who qualify for DAPA. Those people are considered low priority for deportation, and they shouldn't be placed in deportation proceedings.
So President Obama has justified these policies, and his administration has justified them saying, well, these people who are eligible were low priority for deportation anyway. We weren't really actively deporting them. Is that true?
Not in my experience, unfortunately. One of our hopes with this new announcement is that the priorities will be enforced more rigorously, but we have seen repeated announcements of new priorities over the course of the Obama administration, and we have not seen those playing out on the ground. So we've continued to see families being separated. Sometimes that's because of the policy itself creates significant exceptions, and sometimes that's because the officers on the ground don't apply the policy as written by the officials in Washington.
If we listen to officials in the Obama administration, we might believe the only people being deported are criminals. And if that was the case, why would we need these executive actions to begin with, right?
Right, that's the case, and we have two issues with that. One is it is not true. Folks who don't have criminal convictions have continued to be deported. And second is this idea that the criminal label can be thrown on someone as a shorthand for this is a bad person, this is a threat to public safety, is problematic, particularly in the immigration area, because immigrants themselves have been so criminalized. And so many immigrants have criminal convictions for things related to status. For example, working with false papers, entering the country unlawfully. The president has been using this line, felons, not families. We hear this over and over again. And it's hard because I have many clients who have felony convictions and families, and they have felony convictions because they were working to support their families. And under current existing immigration law, that work was criminalized.
Wow. So why weren't the parents of Dreamers included in this group, those who were DACA eligible? Because it was thought for a long time, people anticipated perhaps that this would be a group that President Obama would encompass in his announcement. And from perhaps reading the news, are you aware if there was some kind of last-minute call, a calculation that was made about how big to make this pool of eligible people?
Yeah, that was a huge disappointment for many people, and it was sort of a reason that the reaction to President Obama's announcement was mixed. It wasn't pure happiness. The Dreamers, as they're called, had been organizing to support their parents basically since they won DACA. And I think it's important to recognize that what President Obama did not spring up from a vacuum. He's been pushed to do this very hard by organizers on the ground for years.
Yeah.
The justification that they gave for not including the parents of those children who are eligible for DACA was a legal one, but it's a pretty thin legal one. They released a 35-page legal memo outlining their authority for the decision, and that memo makes a distinction between parents of U.S. citizens and green card holders who will eventually be eligible for a visa, and parents of DACA folks who do not currently have a visa available for them under the existing immigration law. It's a distinction that doesn't have a lot of support in history, but that's what the president has said.
So in a way, these distinctions almost penalize parents who had children before they came to the U.S. and entered with them, versus people who had children after they came to the U.S. who are now eligible for temporary relief, which is kind of a bizarre thing.
That's right. It puts a lot of similarly situated people in very different situations. So, for example, many DACA eligible folks have brothers and sisters who are U.S. citizens, but some don't. And so some parents will be able to get the new status and some won't. And in many cases, the families are equally deserving when you look at the merits of the case.
Now, there were some other groups that were left out of the policy announcement, the executive action. One of them was agricultural workers, farm workers. Why were they left out?
You know, the president made a decision to base this relief on family ties and on length of time in the United States. They don't, in their legal memo, give a legal justification for why they didn't include agricultural workers. And so that's simply a political calculation.
Another one was the issue of, and I'm not quite sure, in his speech, President Obama on November 20th said, "I'll make it easier and faster for high-skilled immigrants, graduates, and entrepreneurs to stay and contribute to our economy as so many business leaders have proposed." But did he in fact do that?
That has not been part of the official announcement as far as DAPA
But he
and
said it in his
DACA.
speech.
Yeah, so they may be considering sort of tinkering on the edges with certain requirements for folks who come here on student visas, for example, to stay and work. The announcement, covered a few things other than DACA and DAPA. They've changed some of the enforcement programs, as I mentioned, and they're considering some other tweaks to immigration law.
Right. Now, let's talk about how successful the original, the 2-year-old program, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, has been. How many people, as far as you know, have applied, and why haven't more done so?
Well, about half the folks who are eligible have actually applied for the program.
And in numbers, that translates to roughly?
That's roughly a few million. And of those, the majority have been approved. And so it really has been transformative for many people who, for example, graduated college and then had to go back home and live with their parents and were cleaning houses because they couldn't basically use their college degrees to get work, have been able to sort of get jobs and get driver's licenses and really emerge from the shadows. There's a huge number of people who haven't been reached. Mostly those people are in rural areas or in the middle of the country, and so I think there's still a big challenge under that program to reach those folks.
They may not be aware that they're eligible, etc.
They may not be aware. The cost is also a barrier. It costs $485, and it's an application fee that's every 2 years, and that's not an insignificant amount of money for many folks, and so that's also been a barrier.
So if it's every 2 years, then some of those, that first wave of applicants likely were renewing or are renewing their deferred deportation relief now or in earlier part of this year, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there a deadline? Is there an expiration date for this policy at which point they can no longer continue to apply for renewal?
There is not one under the current policy, but one of the sort of weaknesses of executive action as compared to actually passing a new law is that a new president can change the program however he or she would like.
Right. So if Congress had passed law that laid this exact same thing out, it would make it much harder for a new president. A new president would have to go through the entire legislative process, whereas the next president of the United States could technically simply use his or her discretionary authority to undo what Obama did.
That's true, and I think that's where it becomes really important to understand how the policy came about and that there are so many invested people around the country who committed to organizing, put their bodies on the line really to make the president do this. And so I think, although a new president could theoretically remove these programs, I don't think it could happen quietly. I think it's harder to take away a benefit that's been given than to not give it in the first place. And I think there would be a huge fight and a huge outcry. But as a legal matter, yes, clearly a subsequent president could undo President Obama's action.
And is this 2-year renewal process similar to this new program for parents?
Yeah, the processes are very similar.
Okay. And so just in terms of how people have responded to Obama's announcement, there was a Gallup poll recently that found that the president's approval ratings among Latinos jumped 10 points, significantly higher than the average among other groups. So clearly there's a group of people here who desperately want President Obama to continue doing what he has done. But of course the GOP response to this is that the sky is falling. We've offered amnesty. Have you been seeing severe exaggerations in the media of what this policy would do? Are there any favorites that you have of what Republicans think this policy would actually do?
I mean, I think the overall tone suggesting that somehow the president doing this on his own is tyrannical or, an abuse of power, to me is interesting because you don't normally think of tyranny expressing itself in, a political officer of government doing something that benefits a marginalized, vulnerable group of people and actually protects them from the power of the state. It's not as if the president is sort of coercing folks. He's given a benefit to a group of people who have contributed to this country, worked hard and fought hard for what they won. And so the idea that somehow that represents, the first steps of tyranny is to me a little bit ridiculous.
It looks like House Speaker John Boehner might be moving away from the GOP threat of defunding the government over executive action and actually taking the president up on a challenge that he made, which is come through with legislation. If you don't like what I'm doing, then go ahead and legislate comprehensive immigration reform. Let's talk very briefly about this issue. Comprehensive immigration reform, that rallying cry, those three words had been the banner for Democrats, for some establishment immigrant rights groups in D.C. for years to no avail, and nothing had changed until 2012 and now 2014 when these executive actions were announced. Does the comprehensive immigration reform approach to immigration even have any humaneness ensured in it? I mean, they could enact a comprehensive reform project that could involve deporting all 11 million people.
Right. I mean, this sort of, as you said, has become sort of the catchword in Washington, but what it means is unclear. I think it means different things to different people, and that's why it's easy to get everyone to say, oh, we agree on comprehensive immigration reform.
Kind of like how people elected Obama. Everybody put their own projection of hope onto him. At the end, we'll see.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think, this action has sort of made progress on one of the key components of any comprehensive immigration reform, which is the legalization of folks who are living here, who are part of this country and who've been here for decades.
Do you fear that the GOP, with the control of the House and the Senate, could push through and give President Obama a bill that they would dare him to sign that would undo DACA and DAPA?
Nothing that the GOP has done on immigration in the past 4 years has given any indication that they can pass any type of bill. The Senate,
even a severe one?
The Senate passed with bipartisan support, obviously, an actual comprehensive immigration reform bill that would legalize many people. The House has toyed with various different, types of bills, but has not actually come up with any concrete proposal that's realistic in any way.
And if they did deliver something to President Obama, it would be interesting to see whether he would use a veto or not, given that he is essentially dared them, and they might call his bluff. So we'll certainly see. Finally, can you explain for our listeners what the starting point of a process to apply if they think they might be eligible is? Because we certainly know that there are many immigrants among our audience.
Right. So the most important thing is to get good legal advice. And we know, unfortunately, that there are a lot of folks out there giving bad advice or passing themselves off as lawyers, these notarios who don't actually have authority to give advice on legal matters. And so the most important thing is to get good advice. There are community organizations out there that will be holding trainings, teaching people about their eligibility, and there are lawyers that can be consulted. There is no application process yet. This is not going to go into effect for a few months. And so the thing to do now is to sort of assess your eligibility, gather documents that prove that you've been living in the United States since 2010, gather documents that prove that you have U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident children, and get good advice.
What about the expansion of DACA? Are those people able to apply right away, or do they also have to wait?
That also doesn't go into effect right away, and so the main thing to do now is to prepare.
And briefly, for our Los Angeles area audience, there's going to be a free informational meeting on Sunday, December 14th from 10 a.m. to 12 noon at the Los Angeles Convention Center, 1201 South Figueroa Street, for people to attend if they would like information about whether they might be eligible for relief from deportation under President Obama's new policy. That's an event that's been sponsored by KPFK, and more information is at kpfk.org. Jessica Karp, best of luck to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And give out a website, by the way, for your organization, End Alone.
It's www.ndlon.org.
End Alone is the National Day Labor Organizing Network, and Jessica Karp, my guest, is a staff attorney with that organization, one of the primary organizations that has really led the fight for President Obama to announce his executive action. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go live to Lima, Peru. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. About 2 months ago, hundreds of thousands of people around the world took to the streets in a People's Climate March to demand action on climate change. Now, at the United Nations Climate Conference in Lima, Peru, those activists will find out whether their cries for action were actually heard. Yesterday marked the beginning of the conference, where delegates from more than 190 countries will set the agenda for next year's climate meeting in Paris. The ultimate goal for the UN Conference on Climate Change is to prevent a 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degree Fahrenheit rise in world temperatures. But with 2014 being the hottest year on record, after 20 years of climate talks, environmental groups remain skeptical about whether politics can be set aside for the greater good of the planet. Two countries responsible for 42% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, China and the US, have already made promises to reduce their emissions. The US has pledged to reduce emissions by up to 28% below 2005 levels by the year 2025, and China has promised to reduce emissions after the year 2030. The European Union, which is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has also pledged to cut emissions 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. While these promises might seem encouraging, none of them are actually legally binding, and the UN has determined that carbon emissions need to be reduced well before 2030 in order to avoid catastrophic warming. Joining us now live from Lima is Dr. Michael Dorsey. He is the interim director of the Program on Energy and Environment at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. He was a member of Senator Barack Obama's Energy and Environment presidential campaign team. He also served on the EPA's National Advisory Committee. He is at the conference in Lima. Welcome to Uprising, Michael.
Sonali, thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, tell us who is at this conference. Is it only country delegates, or are there also representatives from corporations that are present? Are there members of civil society and activist groups that are inside?
Indeed, all of those entities and organizations are here at the 20th meeting of the countries working on the climate negotiations. We've got many corporations that are here. Many of them are aligning themselves in associations. One big association of perhaps more than 1,000 of them is the International Emissions Trading Association. You've got oil and gas companies represented. You also have a great number of large civil society organizations, representatives from the U.S., like the Sierra Club from around the world, Friends of the Earth, as well as the member states of the United Nations that are also here, that are working out the agreements that we're going to hopefully see coming out of Peru.
Now, I understand that the conference is being held on the grounds of a military area with more than 12,000 police guarding the venue. Is this kind of security necessary, and why did the Peruvian government invest so much in installing this kind of show of force?
Well, oftentimes at diplomatic events like this and multilateral meetings, the venues are not the most ideal locations, and indeed, security is an issue. It always is when you have heads of state coming to meetings, but the venue is one that's on the military base, and it is indeed drawing on the resources of the Peruvian army and so forth, but nothing really uncommon with that. No different than the huge security that you see at the General Assembly in New York when blocks and blocks are shut down and creating headache for New Yorkers, etc.
Now, Michael Dorsey, I know you've attended many of these conferences, and perhaps like people who have attended these conferences, you might be jaded about progress, but maybe not, given the U.S.-China agreement that was announced that was considered groundbreaking, if not strong enough, but also this announcement by the U.S. to fund the Green Climate Fund, which has been a very important point for developing nations to move forward, countries like Brazil, to move forward in pledging to reduce emissions, given these sorts of things that have happened in just recent months, as well as the People's Climate March. Is this meeting any different from previous meetings?
Sonali, I wouldn't say I'm jaded. I'd say I'm focused in reality, focused in real numbers. And while the press has, applauded the commitments both from the U.S. to make an injection of capital into the Green Climate Fund, as you point out, and applauded the decision between China and the U.S. to sort of make non-binding commitments on an agreement perhaps that we'll come to in Paris next year. The reality is that the monies that the U.S. has committed are very, very short. They fall on the lower end of what's necessary. And at the same time, the lack of a real binding agreement that China and the U.S. are willing to engage in underscores the fact that we need to have higher ambition coming out of these meetings. I wouldn't say that that's jaded at all. That's really rooting oneself in the facts and the reality of the matter. And when you do the math across the commitment that the United States is making to the Green Climate Fund, we just take the countries in Africa that we know are going to be harmed the most and going to be harmed the worst. We see that the amounts are really paltry sums. You get less than a few $100 million per year for all of Africa. And when we do the math dividing across more than 50 countries, we could have no fewer resources possible for those that are going to be harmed most and worse by this unfolding climate crisis. So the reality is that while it's important, this initial commitment that the U.S. made, it falls very, very far short from what's needed to get out ahead of the unfolding climate crisis that's going to harm places like Africa as well as Asia and Latin America.
So in that case, then, will that move actually do anything to push enough countries forward? Will there be any serious room for negotiation at this climate conference, or is this yet another exercise in futility, as the Copenhagen conference 5 years ago seemed to have been?
Well, I think really what we're going to see is continued pressure from civil society organizations that are here involved in this process, both pressuring and trying to hold governments accountable, as well as trying to prevent many of the corporations that are here that are trying to have watered-down agreements come out of these negotiations. I think the burden squarely falls on those members of civil society, of organizations like Sierra Club, like Friends of the Earth International, and so forth, to hold derelict governments accountable, to keep corporations from distracting us from what's necessary by getting governments to really enforce regulations and begin to make real commitments to reduce emissions, both in the United States but also worldwide.
And how much leeway do these organizations have against their governments? I mean, isn't there often this sort of finger pointing that goes on at these conferences where countries say, I will if you will, and then you have countries like Australia that have made a complete about turn under the leadership of Prime Minister Tony Abbott, pulling back from some weak aspects of progress that Australia had made. This sort of finger pointing one to the other tends to result in very little potential for movement, no matter how sincere these groups like Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth might be.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the dangers here, and we're seeing a little bit of this early on, in some of the opening press conferences from yesterday on the first day, many of the non-governmental organization representatives, praising President Obama and so forth, and praising these relatively paltry, lackluster commitments from the U.S. and from China. So the challenge will be for those more, I'll say, realistically rooted members of civil society, lots of young people in particular, to hold governments accountable and to continue to keep up the pressure, not just on governments, but on corporations. I point out the examples of a great deal of folks in the United States, for example, pressuring to basically put an end on the build-out of coal-fired power plants and to put an end to coal-fired power as we know it and deliver forth 21st century energy technologies. That move has largely been driven by citizens, some of them in large environmental groups, some of them working with their own communities and members of their communities. So the burden really falls squarely not just on the big environmental groups who love to get photo ops with representatives and government officials and so forth, but it really falls on those individuals and communities that are working at the grassroots level, working for climate justice, working for environmental justice, against the low-level ambition of governments like that's what's coming out of Washington, as well as the obstruction that we see from the large emitters, coal industry and the oil industry.
Well, Michael Dorsey, let's put the current meeting in Lima into context. Essentially, it's supposed to lay the groundwork for an agreement in Paris next year, the next major conference led by the United Nations. Is that conference in Paris a sort of last chance for international coordinated effort to reduce emissions? And if so, is that chance seemingly slipping out of our grip given what you're seeing in Lima?
You know, I won't say it's the absolute last chance, but we're getting very, very near the last chance, as it were. It doesn't look hopeful. The prospects for a significant agreement to come out of the talks a year from now in Paris seem to be dismal. What does look hopeful is that we'll have an agreement that essentially everybody agrees with, and the reason why they can do so is because there are no commitments in the agreement. So what better agreement to have than one that's empty, one that doesn't bind countries? Of course, everybody wants to get on board with that because it doesn't commit them to make any serious changes. The reality is that social movements, grassroots organizations are going to have to keep pressure on governments nationally as well as internationally on corporations. And that, I think, is the hope we have. I don't think we're going to see a bold, meaningful agreement come out of Paris. And most people, I think, are beginning to recognize that, particularly, those that are able to have the ability to see through the kind of the media buzz that's been created by the China-U.S. agreement. And when you really look at that agreement, you find that there are no binding commitments that either country has to sign on the dotted line to commit themselves to.
Finally, Michael Dorsey, you served on Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign team on energy and the environment. Are you disappointed by the leadership or lack thereof that he has had on the issue of climate? What advice would you give him at this moment in his tenure?
Well, I think the president, has done, to some extent, a decent job with, the new backing of the carbon rule and using executive order accordingly. But so much more needs to be done. I think he's able to do so much more, and at a minimum to lead in a more ambitious way and lead the nation in an aspirational way. Now, the reality is, of course, we have a derelict Congress that's sort of worked him into a hard place. But the fact is that the level of ambition that comes out of the White House is relatively low. It's certainly by no means, what we assumed during the campaign so many years ago. So much more needs to be done. And I think in these last few years, much more can be done, at least in terms of pointing the way to the sort of higher ground, to the big aspirations. Essentially the president has the opportunity to put us on a moonshot towards rethinking energy policy in America, but his policies are putting us in really low Earth orbit. So much more can be done and has to be done.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Michael Dorsey, so much for joining us today, and we hope to talk to you one more time as the conference wraps up to see what came of it. My guest, Dr. Michael Dorsey, live from Lima, Peru, where the United Nations Climate Conference is being held. Day one was yesterday. He is the interim director of the Program on Energy and Environment at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And as I mentioned, he was a member of Senator Barack Obama's Energy and Environment presidential campaign team. He's also served on the EPA's National Advisory Committee. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at what's been unfolding in Egypt as the Arab Spring Revolution comes full circle. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. An Egyptian court on Saturday dropped all charges against former dictator Hosni Mubarak, who stepped down more than 3 years ago after a mass movement brought the country to a standstill. Mubarak was charged with ordering the killing of hundreds of Egyptian protesters, but the decision to drop charges has confirmed the worst fears of those involved in the historic Tahrir Square protests that the revolution has been undone. The decision to drop charges was apparently based on Mubarak's old age. His 2 sons and one of his business colleagues were also acquitted. Many pro-Mubarak officials have been released in the past several months. In response, Egyptian students have taken to the streets once more, with nearly 100 people arrested and at least 2 people killed in clashes with police. Political cartoons depicting the return of the old guard have given expression to the frustration felt by ordinary Egyptians. Egypt's top prosecutor has promised to appeal the ruling. Also in Egypt this week, a militant organization saying it is affiliated with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria announced that it had killed an American oil worker named William Henderson. The group, named Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, published photos of Henderson's passport and ID cards online. My guest is Seif Da'na. He is an associate professor of sociology and international studies at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, specializing in the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome to Uprising, Seif.
Welcome. Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, is Mubarak free, or is he going to be free very soon, walking around a free man, or at least being carried around in a stretcher, as photos showed? And is he indeed too old to face charges?
Well, basically, he will be free in the next 2 months because currently he's serving a sentence of 3 years. And according to the regulations in Egypt, he served most of it, although he did that in a hospital. But he was freed only for 9 months, and that will be deducted from the time from the 3.5 years that he's supposed to serve for other charges that are not related to this, actually, but it's a corruption charges. But the charges regarding killing hundreds of being responsible, politically at least, for killing the hundreds of Egyptian demonstrators and rebels during the January 25th revolution was actually overturned. He was sentenced to life previously in the first session of the court. And after the appeal, what happened 2 days ago is essentially that the court overturned the sentence and set him free. So after 2 months, he will be most likely set free.
So how do you respond to this? I mean, what does this momentous decision signify? I mean, I recall more than 3 years ago, the elation that Egyptians and people around the world felt for Egyptians as Mubarak stepped down, as people thought this would mark the end of a dark era in Egypt. Has that all been undone?
Well, not necessarily. What we've seen is a formation of a new regional order. Yes, counter-revolution is in full motion in the whole region, not only in Egypt. In Tunisia as well, we've been seeing similar things. But essentially what we have is a return of the old regimes in new faces, with new faces. In this case, it's General Sisi. But that has a lot to do with the regional order, really. In other words, overturning the sentence, Mubarak's sentence, has a lot to do with the formation of a new regime. So Sisi is actually paying the price of a very generous Saudi and United Arab Emirates support to stabilize his regime. What we have in the region is currently 3 camps, basically. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and to some extent Israel on one side. Their nemesis are essentially the other 2 camps, Qatar, Turkey, who are basically supporting the Muslim Brotherhood organizations of the former President Morsi of Egypt. And the 3rd camp is essentially Iran, Syria, and resistance movements in the region. And the 3 camps have clashes, points of clashes, but also points of agreement. But at this point, what we're seeing is Saudi Arabia is very active, unlike Saudi Arabia a few years ago. And their point actually is to overturn the achievements of the Arab people during the revolutions because they are worried about the Saudi regime and the spread of the uprisings from Egypt, Tunisia, and the rest of the Arab world to Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf states. And this is part of it. So they've been supporting Sisi on conditions, and one of these conditions is to set Mubarak free.
What about ousted President Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood and his thousands of supporters who've been imprisoned? And this was a sort of a interesting turn of events in Egypt when Morsi was elected, and then when he was ousted, Muslim Brotherhood supporters became the sort of defenders of democracy, or at least that's how they cast themselves. They're the ones who are now sort of casting themselves, seeing themselves as martyrs against Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the new president, and neither of these camps, it seems, neither the Muslim Brotherhood nor the army leadership seems to really reflect what happened in Tahrir Square.
Well, true. Actually, the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi as well try to exploit the events of the revolution to their own advantage and to the advantage of their own parties. Unfortunately, the performance of Morsi was terrible as well. That does not justify the military coup d'etat, though, because he was in the final analysis, he was an elected president. And he should have left to serve the rest of his term, and the people could change him. But what we've seen basically is certain mistakes during the revolution that Egypt is paying for dearly now, unfortunately. There was a period of 2 months in which the constitution was suspended at the beginning of the revolution. And this was the time in which Mubarak should have been tried before a revolutionary court, instead of leaving that to the prosecutor, who it turned out that putting him in prison was for his own protection at this point from any revolutionary tribunal. And eventually, instead of standing for a political court, basically because he impoverished Egypt and all the corruption and misuse of power and impoverishing the whole nation, he stood for a criminal court. And this made it very easy and very possible for his lawyers to exploit the loopholes in the legal system and the shortcomings of the regulations to set him free, as we've seen. So basically, the court said Mubarak will be set free really based on shortcomings in the law, basically that they're not meeting the accusations or they are not meeting certain demands. Interestingly, the same charges are being brought against President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he will be convicted. So that shows that the legal system is very political in Egypt, despite the tradition in Egypt that it is independent to some extent from the political leadership. That showed that it was not really in this case. It was a very political tribunal. The judge, one last thing, the judge actually gave a very political speech at the end after the verdict. The judge gave a long political speech, which confirmed that this was a political trial, not a criminal as they claimed it will be.
Now, Seif Da'na, another challenge that the criminal justice system faced in Egypt recently was the issue of how the country ought to tackle the widespread practice of female genital mutilation, or FGM. There was a 13-year-old girl named Sohair al-Bata who died from this terrible practice. And for the first time in Egyptian history, I understand there was a criminal case taking on those who were responsible, but they were acquitted. How serious a problem in this, and can you put it into the context of Egypt's current political situation?
Well, this is a very serious issue, even if it's one case. Now, there is a difference between saying it's a very serious issue, and I'm not trying to minimize that, and to say that it's a widespread practice in Egypt. It is not in that sense, and it is illegal in Egypt to do that, and it is also against the Islamic tradition to do that.
And actually, just to interrupt you, some reports putting numbers at between 70 to 90% of women and girls having to go through this. Are these numbers not accurate? 70 to
Well,
90%?
yeah, what I'm saying is, as contrary to some perceptions that think of it in terms of thousands. Again, I said this is a very serious issue, and the legal system and the political system should actually address that very seriously. I was talking about a totally different issue, the way it's perceived outside Egypt and outside the region. Of course, this is a very serious issue, and I said even if it was one case, and it's not a one case. But I guess unfortunately the Egyptian context at this time is so occupied with so many things, and I'm not sure that. The current regime, or like the previous regime, like both actually previous regimes, the Muslim Brotherhood regime and the Mubarak regime, is not going to give this issue enough attention,
right.
or the attention it deserves and it should actually get.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they won't. And the legal system in Egypt is full of loopholes and shortcomings. So it's not going to deal. It's not effective to deal with this issue, unfortunately.
Well, and finally, let's turn to the issue of the U.S. oil worker William Henderson, who reportedly has been killed by a group aligning itself with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Does this killing represent the spreading of ISIS ideology to Egypt? You mentioned earlier that resistance groups on the ground like Iraq and Syria were sort of on the opposite side of the Saudi-UAE alliance.
Yes, ISIS it does exist in Sinai, but there are actually the situation in Sinai Peninsula is a bit complicated because President Sisi is also trying to use that as an excuse to crack down on his opposition as well, to place Gaza under siege, although the Palestinians have nothing to do with this, and also to crack down against his secular opponents as well. We've seen that happening in the last month or so. A serious crackdown against the opposition, right. the secular opposition as well. But ISIS does exist. And it's a product of ignoring Sinai for a very long time. Sinai is one of the poorest areas in Egypt, but also this ISIS is really signifies again reflects the tension in the region. And right. it is supported actually by certain regional forces, so it's not really right. 100% Egyptian product. Right. It's also supported by regional forces. One of them would be, in this case, Qatar, actually.
Thank you so much, Seif Da'na, for joining us. My guest, Seif Da'na, is an associate professor of sociology and international studies at the University of Wisconsin, Parkside. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and our program director. Camilo Ramirez and Christian Becker are our production interns. Annie Mendoza is our media intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kulhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.